So I'm going to start. My name is Marie Ferré. I'm working as a research fellow at the University of Leeds, and in particular for the Integrated Catchment Solutions Program, ICASP. And I've been involved in designing this protocol that we are going to present today. Maybe Julia, you can continue after me.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I'm Julia Martin Ortega. I'm professor of ecological economics at the University of Leeds, and I'm the lead academic on this environmental valuation strand of work that we are doing in the program, and in collaboration with Marie and Manolis, we're putting together this protocol. The motivation for me to have this training is because there's one thing as an academic that really makes my life worth, is trying to think that my research is actually useful for somebody else than just academic. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share this knowledge with you and also hear back from you about how this can be made useful for you.
Manolis?
Yes, so hello everyone. My name is Manolis. I'm also a research fellow at the University of Leeds. I guess part-time working in ICASP, and I had a blast actually working on this deliberative monetary valuation thing. So I'm an economist by trade. I work in a couple of European projects, Horizon 2020 at the University of Leeds. So yeah, my experiences on these types of methods on environmental valuation, how to value the environment. So yes, I'm really happy to be taking part. I'll have a small role, but hopefully helpful.
So this is just to set the frame of where we are at, or why are we here? And I think probably most of you are familiar, just to put everybody in the same page. So as you know, this is part of what we call the Yorkshire Integrated Catchment Solution Program, which we refer to as ICASP. So this is a program which is funded by NERC, and with the aim to generate benefits for the Yorkshire region by applying environmental science to catchment challenges. So this is led by the University of Leeds, but we're in partnership with 16 regional partners, which are non-academics, of which the Yorkshire Peatland Partnership is one of the key partners in this partnership. And the whole idea of ICAS is that together between the universities and these local partners, we co-develop what we're calling science-based solutions to respond to the regional needs. So actually the core of this is translating existing evidence and existing science. The idea is that we in the universities have accumulated all this knowledge about how we make it useful for people like you, practitioners, people who are on the ground trying to provide solutions to the various catchment challenges. In that context of ICAS, we have specifically been working with YPP, but also with More for the Future partnership, specifically to provide scientific support to estimate the values of the benefits of peatland restoration. So this emerged as part of this conversation that happened in ICAS as one of the sort of core needs. And I think it has been very evident in your motivations when you were explaining why you were interested in this. This is clear that there is a need on estimating the values of peatland restoration, but also to communicate about those values and to raise public awareness about them. So several of you have been mentioning how you have to actually report back to your funders about this. So how to communicate, first how to estimate and then how to communicate about those values to the various bodies, whether it's funders, whether it's the public more generally. Also related to that is, in trying to make the case for investment in restoration. So as you say, we're spending public money, this is generating benefits, we need to demonstrate that. And as we demonstrate that, we might be able to secure further investment in restoration. But also try to help take decisions about where to restore. Of course, there is an element of that has to do with the biophysical conditions of the peatlands ecosystems, but also where, how to decide where to place our investment in peatland restoration to maximize the social benefits that we obtain for that. So this emerged as needs, working with YPP and More for the Future, and that gave birth to the first project that happened in this context, which was focused on trying to identify the methods for the monetary valuation of benefits from peatland restoration. So here the idea was that we wanted to develop an understanding of what were the scientifically robust methods to value the different ecosystem services. So that's one of the needs that Jenny and colleagues expressed to us. but also to learn how to and best to apply them. So these methods exist. They are not easy. How is the best way to apply them? And the whole idea, and this is an important part, I think, because, you know, when I first started engaging with Jenny and colleagues and others, I always thought that, well, you know, the motivation was, you know, you wanted to have evidence of the values. You wanted us to undertake the valuation studies for you. And very soon I realized that actually what the real motivation was is actually for people like you, for practitioners, to be able to incorporate those methods to your own restoration strategies, to, in a way, to add them to your toolkits and your set of capabilities to be able to apply these methods by yourself. And that was a bit of an eye-opening for me, because it meant that, you know, it was not about just estimating values, about working together with you guys on how can we help you implement those methods. With the idea in principle for you to apply themselves. Obviously, there's some methods which are too complicated and require very advanced knowledge, but at least that gives you the sense, okay, this is maybe too difficult to do in-house or too expensive to do in-house. I need to outsource it. But at least that helps with planning your restoration activities and project activities. So that's what gave birth to the Valuation user guide, which I think many of you probably have already. I hope that you have seen. You can let us know if you haven't, but I bet you have. So this is this first document, which we created together, co-developed with YPP and Moors for the Future, which gives an idea. So we created this user guide. You know, this user guide provides an overview of all the existing methods that are available for doing valuation, and this is organized by type of ecosystem service. And it also includes different guidelines on how to apply them. Now, this is not the holy grail of, if you read this guide, this means that that's it, you know how to do everything, but hopefully it provides you with sufficient guiding points into approaching the wall of the methods for valuation. Okay, so that was the first output that we produced as part of that process. Now, working further with Jenny and colleagues, you know, we're very happy to see that YPP has already started using the Valuation user guide, for example, in support of the EPS pilots, the England's Pillar Strategy pilots. Okay, so that was a great satisfaction to us, because we saw how, you know, you were able to go through the process of identifying the different methods. But precisely as part of, you know, going through that process, it emerged the interest in saying, well, actually, from the various methods that are available, this particular one, which is called Deliberative Valuation method, which is the focus of today's discussion, seemed to be particularly relevant for the needs that, you know, that Jenny was identifying at the moment. And Marie will be commenting a little bit on that. So through this process, Jenny asked us whether we could produce this protocol, which is a step-by-step guidance on how to apply this particular method. Okay, so, and this is the reason why we're here today. So just remember, there is a suite of methods, okay, that are suitable for different ecosystem services, different conditions, different contexts, etc. All that is in the user guide. And what we're doing today is zooming into one of the methods. And Marie will explain the reasons why this method seemed to be particularly interesting for the context of YPP. Okay, but just so you get the idea that this is not the only way to approach things, there is various ways to approach this. We're zooming into this particular one. And as you can see on the slide, we have a quite packed agenda, so I hope you had a good lunch and ready to brew some coffee along the side, because as you see, we have we're going to go through a number of activities. So we're also going to ask you to do some offline homework, okay, just to help us prepare for a bit of more interactive session. So this means that a quarter past three, if everything goes fine, you will have you will be ready to have your break after we have had a first sort of interactive session with you after some offline work. And then we will be discussing how we use those. We have a separation between individual values and group share values. We will explain that in a moment. We'll be discussing that. And we also want to put some emphasis on, you know, the usage that you can make of these values. Okay, then we'll have another break at 4:15. And then there will be enough time, I hope, for us to have an interactive session for you to be asking us questions. As Marie was saying, feel free to be asking questions in the chat, and we will be trying to answer them as we go along, but definitely there will be room at the end for more interactive discussion and questioning of the process.
So now you should be able to see the next section. So here I'm going to give you a brief introduction on what this method is, so the deliberative monetary valuation method. So it's an environmental valuation technique which can be used to value benefits that ecosystems provide to humans. And the difference of other methods, so if we look at the other methods that are presented, for instance, in this valuation user guide that Julia was mentioning, the deliberative monetary valuation method incorporates the deliberative process. So this is this interaction or exchange component that is really at the core of the method. And the method encourages discussion and learning among participants in order to generate agreed group-based values of the benefits of the ecosystem that you are considering. So that means it allows to capture really broader aspect of well-being beyond the monetary indicator only. But as any other method, it has its limitation. It's not exempt of criticism. So if you want to know more about the in-depth limitation of this method, you can always refer to the resources that we have listed at the end of the protocol. Here we'll only highlight the key steps and the key aspects. In terms of organization, this method can be implemented over one or several group sessions where participants have really opportunity to discuss, to exchange, to interact. This is what is the key things actually of this method. And it involves specifically design facilitation. And that is why actually the protocol was born, because it really lays down step by step the steps that are necessary to facilitate such a session. So how and when you might want to apply it. So yeah, practitioners like you who are interested in independently valuing or discussing value of ecosystem services could apply such a method, because really it can fit such a purpose. But it may not only be useful for peat and restoration practitioners like you, but also other practitioners who are dealing with management of resources, environmental issues, conservation projects. So as I said, this protocol will focus mainly, it focuses on the example of peat and restoration and the benefits that are derived from restoration, but it can be adapted to fit other type of ecosystems. An advantage, a crucial advantage actually of this method, and probably the reason why you are particularly interested in it, is that it can be easily integrated into ongoing project activities like public engagement events, information sessions. However, you need to be particularly careful on that because the nature of the sample population that we recruit for the event will have an effect on will have implication on how you can use the values that you obtain. And for having more details on that, you can, there is a lot of explanation on this particular point in the protocol. There are different things that you can gain from applying this method. First of all, is to gather evidence on the social values of the ecosystem, so of peatlands, and that will be useful for feeding into the existing evidence. So the user guide was listing or illustrating some of the method with specific case studies. Actually, by applying this method, you might create your own case studies, which can feed maybe in the next version of the user guide. It can also be very useful to inform an economic analysis of a restoration project. So to understand, for instance, whether it's worthwhile, economically speaking, to go for a specific restoration investments. Through applying this method, you will also gain a picture of public perception and how this perception might change depending on the information that you provide to people. You will get insights that can inform policy, and that is not only from the values, but also from the different type of interactions that will happen among your participants. And it's also a great opportunity to have a mix of people from different fields, maybe with different interests, and get them in the same room, discuss a management issue, which might be actually maybe sensitive or may really have a different type of interest around the people. So, and get maybe people reach an agreement around values. So it's a unique opportunity also in that sense. And yeah, Julia will now continue after me and give you an introduction to the structure and the general content of the protocol.
But I just want to reiterate what Marie has just said. It's very, very important that, yes, this fits into your outreach activities, but how you design the way in which you recruit people to participate is going to have critical implications to the meaning of the values that you are going to obtain. So this means that you have to very carefully plan the way you get to those people to invite them to these sessions very carefully, because that's going to mean one thing or the other for your results, particularly in the values. So we have put quite a lot of care in the protocol to emphasize this. And if you have questions about that, we will answer them, because this is one of the sort of pillars of, it fits very well outreach activities, but careful, because depending on how you do it, it means one thing or the other. Okay. So now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty of the protocol. Okay. So first, just let me tell you, the way in which we have structured the protocol. So the protocol is structured in 3 main parts, which we have, simply labeled A, B, and C. But everything that refers to before the deliberative session. So it's all the things that you need to prepare, all the things that you need to think in advance, and all the things that you actually need to know in advance before carrying out the session. So everything is going to revolve about this session, which is when you actually have the people with you in a room. Okay, well, in a room or in a Teams meeting, we'll see. Okay, so that's section A, before the session. Then section B, which is what happens during the deliberative session. And this is the actual implementation phase. And I'm going to tell you already that this is what is the bulk of this session today for us, this training, or how you want to call it, of today, this afternoon. It's going to be about helping you go through phase B, because it's the one which is, is the core of it, right? And then we have organized after the session. What do you need to do after the session, and how can you use and communicate about the values and the other information that you have obtained via the session? Okay. So then, as you will have seen in the protocol, you have at the end a list of resources. Some of them are additional resources and some of them are essential. Okay, now this is a fundamental part of the protocol. We have structured it like that, so you could have a narrative, a flow of the before, during, and after. But everything that is within the essential resources is something that really you need to consider. You need to look at when you are thinking about applying this. No? Now, we are not going to be looking at the resources in detail during the training, but we will be a little bit when we feel it's fundamental. But, again, this is one of the things that when you go away and have the chance and go through it, make sure you pay sufficient attention to that. And if you have questions about that, you can also come back to us. Now, another important thing, like a contextualizing element, is that the protocol is focused on the implementation. It's focused on doing, what you have to do first, what you do next, what are the different steps, and how you use that. Now, it is not based on theory, which I'm sort of thinking that you probably appreciate, okay, because it's very practical. But of course, there is a theory behind of these things, and the reason why we have set up things in a particular way is so that they are coherent with that theory. Okay, so if at any point you feel you need to know more, we have provided resources for that, but also the user guide. Remember, the first original output tool that we created does have some comments there on theory that can help you understand why are we doing the things in the way we're doing it. So it's just, some of the things are there not just because we think it will be nice, it's because it's rooted. And respecting those theoretical principles is very important, so the values and the information you get is robust, as I'm sure you agree with. Now, another thing is that the application of the deliberative monetary evaluation method can take various ways. There's not just one unique way of applying this method. Okay, there is possible ways. Now, the protocol that we have put together, we have designed it so it could follow the most simple and the most structured way of doing it. But if you start exploring this area, you might see other forms. Okay, hopefully they all respect those theoretical pillars, but don't think that this is the only way that this is done, and you might find others particularly you can find others which are a bit like more fussy and less structured. We thought, and also some very, very complicated ones. We thought that what you probably wanted more is a simple one, which was structured, so it tells you what, what steps to follow. But this means, because there's not only one possible way, this means that you can also adapt what we have provided you with, and you will have to adapt it to your context, but you can also be more innovative and introduce and adjust other things. We have tried to be careful of telling you which you must and mustn't do, meaning that those things that you have to definitely do or definitely have to avoid. So if you adapt this protocol to another context, or you want to add on things, but just remember which things should still remain or which things should be avoided, so you respect that theory. Okay, so hopefully it's flexible enough in that way, but still relatively structured. Okay, so this is how the protocol is organized. Now, as I said, we're going to dig in quite in depth in part B, which remember is during the session, the deliberative session. Obviously, there is part A, which has to do with the preparations, right? And we're not going to go into this, but we have really, this is a part which is very, very important. Once you finish the training, when you have had the time to reflect, and particularly when you decide you want to do this, when you start to get ready, be sure that you read this very carefully, because it has certain things which are fundamental, are going to affect the rest of the process, right? The first one of them is, as we had already mentioned, the recruitment of the participants, the sampling. So who are you going to be targeting? So what's your target population? How can you get a sample of that population? And then once you have decided who they are, then how are you going to get them? Okay, how are you going to recruit them? Because as I said, each of these elements have implications about how you do it, and very importantly, the meaning of the values that you get. Okay, so this is very detailed now in the protocol. We hope to have been as clear as possible on this. Okay, so we don't go through it now, although we will be making mention to this. But remember, just if you're going to remember one thing from today, please remember this, okay? Because then you can plan it well, okay? Then other elements that part A contains is the design of your session. Whether you're going to have just one session, for example, workshop with one group, or you're going to meet this group several times. You can spread it out, okay? So you can have one or several. Then the format of your session, the logistics that you're going to have with it, whether you are going to associate this with a site visit as well. For example, if you're particularly interested in sites, specific sites, you might want to tag along a site visit. So all that is included there. And also, what is the focus of your evaluation? So are you interested in getting the values for a specific site, a specific restoration project that you're doing, a specific site, or what you're interested is in the ecosystem in general? Like, for example, you want to do, the peatlands in the Yorkshire area, for example. But so it's a generic definition of the ecosystem. It can be geographically grounded, like it can be, for example, Yorkshire, but you're not necessarily interested on this particular site in this particular peatland, but in peatlands in Yorkshire. So that's also going to have effect on how you design your sessions, okay? All that is in the protocol, okay? And we're not going to cover during the session. Now we're going to give you a little bit of homework. Now, hopefully you have had the chance to read the protocol when Marie sent it last week, but we would like you to take the next 20 minutes, okay, to refresh your mind and allow yourself to zoom in a bit of concentrated mode in part B. Okay, so this is part B, during the deliberative session, which in the protocol is from pages 5 to 9. Okay.
Okay, so now we get into the core of the afternoon session, and I'm going to go to the key steps of implementation of the method and highlight the important considerations and principles that you need to have in mind when running such a session. So, first of all, the process is designed to be anonymous and confidential. So in order to keep anonymity among your participants, you will need to allocate them with ID numbers. So as soon as they arrive in the room or the hall for the event, you can allocate them a specific ID number that is unique, and that they will have to refer to in each of the activity that they will be doing during the event. So each paperwork where you ask them to fill with some kind of information, there will be a space at the top where they can indicate the ID number. And you will see that in the resource section, this is already included. This is very important because for you to then, after the session, be able to link the different pieces of data, of information that you have collected, so that you know you can make the story afterwards. So the session that you'll be running, you can start it with a general introduction. And it's important that it's in neutral terms, because you want to be able to elicit people's value for benefits of peatlands without participants being influenced. So for instance, you should not disclose that the focus of the day will be to obtain values. You just keep it on the general level and very neutral terms. And a second key things that is important before starting anything on eliciting values from the people is to collect some data from them on their socio-economic characteristics, and that will be key to understand who is in the room, so to profile your sample population and interpret the values that you obtain later on. So for this particular purpose, we have provided you with a template of questionnaire. So this is in the resource section that includes key question so that you collect really important data that you need to have then when analyzing everything after the session. So now let's look at the valuation itself. So generally, environmental valuation means valuing non-marketed ecosystem services and estimating their monetary values. So for the case of peatlands, it deals with estimating the monetary values of water quality, recreational benefits, and wildlife, for instance, that peatlands provide to society. So it includes capturing stated preferences from the population using the concept of willingness to pay. So we'll be talking a lot about willingness to pay during this afternoon session, and we abbreviate it as WTP. So this concept refers to how much people are willing to give up, so in terms of finances, in terms of income, for the increase in the delivery of a specific good. So here it will be for the increase in the condition of a peatland ecosystem. Okay. So in a sense, with the willingness to pay, you are assigning a monetary value to the increase of well-being that is experienced by the individuals following the improvement of the condition of the peatland. So going from a bad ecological status to a good ecological status, how much people feel they have gained, they would gain in terms of well-being, and that is transcribed then in terms of values. How to capture this willingness to pay, so that is all about it. And for this, I'm going to invite you for a very short activity, and we would like to ask you to look at the valuation card that is provided in the resources of the protocol, and just read it and try to answer the willingness to pay question as if you were a participant. Okay, so we're going to start again. I'm going to share my screen. Highlight here. So basically, I hope you have had enough time to look at the cards, but you can look at it in more details if you would like to at the end. We'll have time for that. So just we would like to now have a small debriefing on what you have seen in the cards. What you have done actually, what you're gonna do when you actually handle this kind of card to your participants. So what you do is that you put people in the situation of what they are going to value. So you ask them how much income the person will be willing to give up for something that they care. So it's about asking them the maximum amount of income the individual will be prepared to give up in that case for the increased in ecological condition of the peatland. So from the increase from the bad status to the good ecological status of the particular peatland that you are describing in your card. So as you can see, this means that the valuation scenario that you are presenting is really, really critical for helping people to actually understand the situation and being able to make the trade-off in their own end. So in that sense, the scenario has to be described very precisely so that you include different type of aspects on, first of all, the environmental change that is being considered. So here it's about shifting from a bad ecological status to a good ecological status and highlighting the key benefits that will change by changing such a condition. So in terms of water quality, support for wildlife and biodiversity. So you highlight what it means exactly in terms of change, in terms of ecosystem services delivery. The second aspect that is critical to include is the geographical extent under which it happens. So the acreage, the extent of change. And in that particular case, you have seen it's 10,000 hectares that we have incorporated. And the third key aspect is the unit and frequency of payments. So in that particular case, it's a tax that will be paid every year. So this position is really critical for people to understand the kind of situation they are in and so that they can give values accordingly. Of course, this is an example that we call it generic case because it doesn't target any particular type of peatlands, and you still have some flexibility in terms of adapting it to your own case or to your own valuation interest. However, there is really some specific consideration to bear in mind when you do so. And for this purpose, we have therefore including a guidance on how you can tailor this card to your specific need, to your specific interest when you want to run the session. So you'll find it also in the resources section. We are not going to go through it now, but just for you to know. An important point is that really the scenario that you propose to the participant has to be realistic, although it's hypothetical. So what you obtain out of this card is a willingness to pay, which we refer to as willingness to pay 1, because that's the first one that we gather from the people. And an important thing is that it follows so this willingness to pay is being collecting following a very succinct information that you give the participant. So you don't give so much information on the type of, so you give minimum level of information on the type of benefits that peatlands provide and the kind of change that you want them to consider, you want them to think about when giving the value. So that you capture through this first willingness to pay what people believe at that particular time with their own knowledge and perception of the ecosystem without having been exposed to more background information, to more understanding of what peatlands are and the kind of benefits they provide and all that. So this is really important that it's you start with this particular card without giving them so much background. That's why we highlighted at the beginning of the session that you give them really neutral information and minimum level of information. So we can conclude as like the framing really matters in that particular case.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in here to reinforce one thing that is important. The reason why we ask you to read the card and answer the question is to give you a very clear idea of what is the process that is happening on people's mind when we ask them to express their willingness to pay. Now, when we do valuation, this is one of the contested areas because it's like, it's not that you're asking people necessarily to pay for restoration, you know, where does the restoration money come from? It's not about that. It's about replicating an internal process that happens in all of our brains when we are faced with the decision to have to pay for something. You know, whenever we pay for something, whether it's food in the supermarket, whether it's our phone, whether it's about the decision to go and recreate somewhere, which means that we're going to have to drive our car and consume fuel, or we're going to buy a train ticket. When we are doing these things, we're always making a trade-off about the well-being gains that we obtain by doing that activity or by buying certain thing. So this is a process in which valuation relies on, is in making the people's trade-off about how much well-being do they get from something and how much are they willing to give up their income to securing that well-being. So that is the process. That is what willingness to pay means. It doesn't mean putting a price on peatlands. It means creating a scenario in which people are forced to go through the process of doing that well-being income trade-off. Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you, Judah. And therefore, for that particular process to happen very well, the clear, precise information is really necessary in the description of your scenario. So, so as I said, you now have captured willingness to pay 1, and now you're gonna want to see willingness to pay when people are actually more informed on the ecosystem, on the peatland ecosystem, and the benefits that it provides. So for that, you get participants informed about the topic that is being valued in different ways, different manners where you can bring them. So it can be a presentation. So you can present them, okay, what is the ecosystem, what are peatlands, how do they look like, the kind of benefits they provide, maybe the purpose of restoration, what is the restoration plan, and how much does it cost, for instance. So that's the kind of key aspect you could bring into a presentation to get them informed about the topic. This can also be completed by a walk, for instance, to a peatland site, so that they get even more exposed to the ecosystem that is being considered here. And you can also use some other type of materials, like a video, for instance. So we are providing in the resources a suggestion of slides, which of course you are very free to tailor it to your need and to your valuation interest when you actually run the session. But again, even if you give more information and more background information to the people, this still has to remain neutral, because you still want to capture the actual view of the participants, and not the view that you convey to them through providing maybe some more influential information through the presentation. Okay, so that is really a key point here. Then you have provided them with background information. You may invite them to an open discussion, and that is really to foster exchanges and exchange of views among participants and between the participants and the facilitator. So one way to foster this discussion may be to ask them whether they have learned anything out of the presentation or out of the walk, whether they had some specific thoughts during this walk. So this is really fostering the exchanges and the discussion at this point. And by doing all this, you start the learning process and you foster the interaction among the participants. After you have done these two things, you then use a new valuation card with exactly the same valuation scenario, exactly the same question that you handle at this point to the participant again, and you ask them to state again their value. And that will give you willingness to pay number 2.
Just to summarize, what you have gone through now is 2 different willingness to pay questions. The first one is with very, very minimal information. So essentially you capture the people's willingness to pay like pre any discussion. And the second one is after you have had discussions. Yeah, okay. And actually after the break, we are going to come back on the use of those willingness to pay that you can make. You want to ask your question now? That's a very good question, Paul. So normally we apply this kind of surveys to people who are over 18, but it's true that not everybody over 18 have income, it's appropriate for them to income. So you can find, depending on your target group, you can find alternative trade-offs for them to do. For example, you can ask them to do trade-off on their time. So how much time are you willing to, you have to frame them in terms of something they're giving up that will be relevant for your target group. However, only income trade-off in this context is something that you can use for economic analysis. So if you want to then do a comparison with cost, you need to monetize this, and at this moment, income is the only way. In other contexts, like for example, in developing countries, people do give up time, and then they can calculate how much money does that time equate to, but it starts getting very complicated to translate another trade-off into money trade-off. But you can definitely, if you are interested in young people, you can find alternative trade-offs, except that then you will not be able to compare that, for example, with cost, for example. Yeah. Or you maybe can, but it's becoming harder and harder, right?
Can I add something on that? It's just in the protocol we do talk about different. We call that payment vehicle, right? So the council tax increase is a payment vehicle. You can decide different payment vehicles. Julia talked about time. A voluntary donation would be another thing. Depends on where you give it, but there are certain things that you need to that you can actually incorporate. We have some in the protocol, so maybe that will be helpful.
What is very important, Paul, is that people need to give up something, okay? And this is not necessarily because this is what we are suggesting now, that peatland restoration gets funded via the council tax. Is not what we are creating. Is a hypothetical situation in which people do feel that they have to make a trade-off, because that's the way we measure the well-being change. That obviously that runs the risk when you're communicating about this, that people think that you're actually proposing a council tax. And that's one of the most contentious issues in valuation, is the fact that we do need to use willingness to pay in a certain payment vehicle, whether it's donation, whether it's council tax, whether it is whatever, a levy, because we need to make people genuinely think, am I willing to give up this amount of my income?
So actually here, this this discussion is only one among others that will happen later on in the session. And actually the next one, which is probably much more major, we actually propose a way of capturing this information. For this first one, we propose it more like maybe also serve a kind of an icebreaker among the participants. However, if you are interested in recording it, it's for sure you could also organize in a way that it's being recorded, and it's probably to give you, as you say, probably good insights on what people think.
Then when these things happen in breakout groups, one useful way of recording these things is that there is always a flip chart, and there's always one scriber per breakout group, which literally takes notes of everything that is being said. Now it's super hard for this person. It breaks your hand. I've done it many times. But there are techniques, and we can discuss later. But those are more like general workshop facilitation techniques about how to get everything written down. Yeah, that's actually, Jenny, the hardest question to deal with, because on the one hand, people have to genuinely answer. They have to believe. They have to sort of ask themselves, am I truly going to do this? So they almost have to believe it's true to be able to genuinely make the trade-off. But at the same time, it is not true that you are actually going to suggest that the council tax. So actually getting the right tone on how to do that. So when you're faced with data question, you just say, this is not for the, we're not running this on behalf of the council, we're not running this on behalf of the government. I just want you with me to be with me for a moment, imagine this reality, accept this reality. So you have to convince them to actually do the trade-off. At the same time, they're explaining that, this information is just used to understand the values when you get to that state, not before. And this will be used to inform various people, but it's not going to feed into the council tax directly. So we'll try to give you some tips on how to do that in the next version of the protocol, but you put a finger on the hardest thing. So you just have to gain their trust. That's why it's a careful process in which you have to look credible, you have to look neutral, you have to be honest about the fact, what kind of organization you are, obviously, because you're not somebody else. And they say, please bear with me a moment and think truly, if you were going to pay this council tax, what would you pay? But it's very hard. We'll try to give you tips on how to do it, but I already anticipate you. Not easy, not easy.
We have a break schedule now.
All right then. After the break, now it's just we're going to use just 5 minutes in order to recap what we just talked about. So we saw different types of individual values. So what are they and how can we use them? As we've said before, these are values that people state about the change in well-being, and they are, of course, in monetary terms. And this change in well-being happens as individuals think and state a value about having more of an ecosystem service. In this case, we talk about peatland. So having more of that, and that increases their well-being. They feel happier, they feel more confident, they feel more secure about the future and so on, about themselves or about others. And these values are basically evidence on the preference of the public for all sorts of activities. In this case, again, this is for peatland restoration. These values, these individual willingness to pay values, can inform policymakers and funders of different projects and investors on how much people value the environment, how much an investment could actually look like if you aggregate those individual willingness to pay values over a certain amount of people. And these are the values, the only values that could be used for economic assessment or business cases, for example, cost-benefit analysis. As we said before, what you need to keep in mind is that sample matters, sample representativeness matters. We talk about that in detail in the protocol. So if you can have the representativeness, then you can actually use them in cost-benefit analysis. If not, if you don't have the representativeness, then that means that your values basically were context dependent on the meeting. So again, a recap: you have two different values: willingness to pay 1 and willingness to pay 2. Willingness to pay 1 comes in the beginning, where there is no specific or special information provided or discussion, and it's just a concise and precise valuation scenario that people are being presented with. Remember, the scenario has to be succinct but also informative, not biasing people, and you ask people about their willingness to pay. And this is what can be used in economic assessments. Then the willingness to pay 2 is exactly the same valuation scenario, but it's been there's more information added to it. This can come through a presentation that they during the workshop. It can happen through a walk in a peatland site and discussion during or after that, so that more information, either visual or scientific, can actually be accumulated. And these values now, they should be different. So willingness to pay 2 should be different than willingness to pay 1. You know, they come after information provision, and people are being exposed to information, right? Scientific information or something visual, but also into the views of others, because people have discussed about this. Now, how did you feel after visiting this site, or how do you feel? What did you think when you heard this piece of information, and so on. And what willingness to pay 2 can do when compared to willingness to pay 1 can capture any change or when you increase people's awareness or information, and if you can see any change in their preferences about this exactly the same thing, about exactly the same activity, let's say restoration of peatlands, and how they change after people have received some information. This, as we said before, they cannot be used in economic assessments, cost-benefit analysis, so on, because these values are context dependent. The specific people who are in that workshop, they are the ones who actually influence these values.
Now you split them into groups. We in the protocol we talk about groups around number of maybe maximum 5 people, odd numbers, and you try to mix the people in the group based on their age, their background, their gender. So you try to not have some groups of people also being sort of similar, so that the deliberation and the discussion actually is more fruitful, hopefully. The other important thing is that you need to tell people, and you need to sort of hopefully empower them to do that, and everybody gets a voice in every group, and they should use it. So they should speak up, they should tell people what they think, and so on. And then also, quite importantly, and I'm going to show you right now how you can do that, you ask people to act as representatives of others. So people who are not in the room, hopefully should be represented by the participants in that workshop. And the way you do that is by telling the participants that they need to self-define themselves. So I'm going to be talking about 4 different steps in this group process, and the first one is this self-defining. So we need to ask people to reflect on who they are. Now, this is a difficult question, maybe, but it's an important one. And this is how you could do it. You ask people to, how do they like defining themselves? And the way you define yourself can be, very, very different, and it can be very broad, but it can be based on, who you are, if you have a family, based on your profession, based on your activities, based on your ideals. And you ask people to define themselves. The key thing here is that you want, as I said, people to act as representative of others, to think of others like them in society, around them, in their neighborhood or where they live, who are like them when they make their choices in the deliberation, when they state their values for restoring, in this case, peatlands. Now, the how you do it, it could be, as I said, it could be varied. And again, this is something people do, but they don't disclose it. You don't tell others of how you define yourself. This is strictly personal. So people in the workshop should actually be given a paper. We talk about that in the protocol, and they write down how they define themselves. And now, just for you and for our own purposes, I would just invite you to, if you want to, just pick up a piece of paper and write that down. How do you define yourself? Who you are? And again, this is confidential. You keep it to yourself, but you keep it in mind as we're gonna keep going through that through this group shared value. So I'm going to still be projecting this so you can actually see this question, but go ahead and try and answer that question.
I think that's probably enough now.
Good. Yes. Okay.
Can I just jump in 1 second, just to talk you through the process that we are going through. So if you see, when we started with Marie, it was you were asked to think about yourself individually. How much are you willing to pay? How much are you willing to do that trade-off? That was an individual, a personal decision. Okay. Then you did the same question, but after you have had the chance to talk to other people, that was willingness to pay too, in which you were given more information. You had this open discussion. You start seeing the views of others. Maybe that changed your mind, that opens your mind to the views of others, but still it's your own individual question. Okay. You're responding from yourself. First, with no information, and second, after having heard the opinions of others. Now, what Manolis is asking you is to start actually moving from the individual to start thinking of yourself, not just as you as an individual person, but you as a type of person, a person who actually probably thinks similar to other people of the same type of people, no? That people like you, for example, you're all conservationists, so you obviously don't represent a particular type of person, you are in a certain age range, so you're starting to move from just yourself to you as a type of person, representing a type of person, not anymore you only, but people like you.
So keep that on the side, what you've written. Hopefully you've written something. And then now in this group phase, so you now we're going to have people who are going to be having a sort of an interactive session. And this session is to help people reflect upon their views. Why do they value the environment like this? Why is it important? Why is it not important to them? And challenge them through the other participants in the group, because people are different. Hopefully this is captured in how you have structured the groups, how you allow them to vary, and you allow people to sort of discuss and talk about their views. And in a sense, you can talk about like that this allows them to shape their mind, to be exposed to the views of others, because usually, as people, we create our own bubbles. We are with the people that we are more similar with, and we can be influenced by the people who are like us. But in a setting like this, you are exposed to views that you don't necessarily hear every day. And as this happens, hopefully, this allows for some sort of agreement and consensus to form within each group. as people deliberate and as people explain why they see something one way and someone else sees it differently, this hopefully will allow some sort of compromise and group feeling to emerge. There are certain ways of facilitating this coming together of people. In the protocol, we suggest a method called the Q method. It's something that has been developed by psychologists and sociologists, which is basically putting together several statements that they are about the subject that you ask people to value, in this case restoration of peatlands, and these statements, they cover a sort of a broad, they cover the whole discourse, so ideas very pro restoration, let's say, or very against restoration, and how people interact with this ecosystem. In the resources, you'll find an example of that and how to do it. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but this is again something that people will need to agree. So several statements, and they need to agree how much they agree or disagree with those statements. So hopefully this allows the group to come together. So what you basically have done in these first two steps is that first you ask people to reflect on themselves, who they are, and take part in a group activity, but then you ask that group to hopefully start having an identity. So people, as they work as a group, they still remember who they are, but they still try to find some sort of consensus within the group. And now, as this has happened, now you ask people to reflect upon another valuation question. So now you ask people about the fair allocation of the public budget. So in this case, you ask people something that we call a fair price. What do you think would be a fair price for a fair increase in your annual tax for restoring peatlands? So this is something that each group has to answer on their own. And people should be answering, remember, step one, as the type of person they identify with. So thinking about the other people are like them in society, would that be feasible for people like me? For other people like me, and then within the group you try to find a consensus. So this is a social value, right? A group from society that the group, each individual group, agrees it should pay for peatland protection. So in order to make that a little bit clearer, I was thinking that we do actually an activity between all of us. So this is something that you need to unmute your microphones. And hopefully I would like us to try and do that. I imagine that we ourselves, the participants here in this training, are actually participants in a deliberative valuation workshop for peatland restoration and how this could actually work. So to actually make it even hopefully better, not worse, I have created an avatar. So not myself, to not say who I am, but someone else. So imagine this is a hypothetical person who is in your group, who has actually joined this Teams meeting. So this is Dan, and this is how Dan defined himself. You don't know it, I don't know it, but this is what he thinks. So he's an outdoor guy who loves watching TV. He's in mid-30s, and he has a typical 9-to-5 job. And now Dan and yourselves you are presented with this question. How would you, all of you as a group, what would you consider as a fair increase in your annual tax for restoring peatlands? I mean, we are still in this annual tax conversation. It could be a voluntary donation, something that comes out of your own pocket and goes for restoration of peatlands. So this is what you have in mind, and this is what Dan says. He's the first one who speaks in the group, and he says, like, for people like me, who don't make that much, but we can save a little bit more because, I'm single. I think maybe £50 a year would actually be right for someone like me, for people like me out there, and probably feasible. So now the question now is for all of you is, do you agree with that? And what value should be acceptable for you individually? So I would like you, if you can, to just speak up. I'm going to still have this slide on, so I won't be able to see who is speaking. So just to speak out, and I will make a note for the values you will say. So what type of value would that be acceptable for each of you? So I'm looking for 6 different answers. when you actually do it with people will be given much more time to go through that. In the protocol, we'll talk about at least 45 minutes for people to sort of discuss that, hash that out. People can change their mind. It's nothing sort of final. But basically now, so I've made notes. So we have a range of values ranging between 20 and 240 a year. So, you know, this is a big range. You know, remember we talk about a fair increase. So if we want to be honest and we want to be true to the meaning of the word fair, something that it's feasible to everyone in the group is the lowest value, right? So it's the 20 or the 24, whatever that is. But now actually what would be good in the groups was to sort of try and hash that out. You know, can we actually go higher than this? Is it possible? Or if not, because then what needs to make sense is that we talk about a fair increase, something that everybody could pay in society, which is hopefully represented by the members of each group. And you try to see that, is that fair? Is it too high or is it too low? Because if it's too low, then probably the benefits will not be as high. I mean, this is, you know, it's the natural deduction out of this thought process. Or if it's too high, actually, maybe if it's high, hopefully the benefits would be high. Right, so this is hopefully something that you should be able to encourage during the session to happen in the groups, and you would like to empower people to say, okay, 20, maybe 40, maybe, I don't know, 30. Right, so.
And this is what the beauty of the discussion is, because, for example, when you're in a group, somebody say, oh no, 20, but then you by this point, people are hopefully a bit more free to talk or feel a bit more confident. Then somebody like Paul will say, but you know, think about how much are you spending on the phone? And then the person who just say 20 say, oh, well, probably I can go to 25. Or then they say, no, really, I'm struggling. Phone is very important. So it's actually discussing together, which may you move around on that figure. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the whole point, you know, if at the end goes with the lowest, it goes with the lowest, but people will have had the opportunity of think through the thinking process of somebody else.
Exactly. So then in the group, hopefully people speak their minds, and then you would like to ask them to reach an agreement within the group. We're not going to do it now just for time purposes, but you would ask people to sort of agree, and the way that you would go you could go about that is to actually vote. So people vote within the group and say, okay, who goes for 40, who goes for 60, and hopefully you would reach you know, whoever gets the higher votes. This is the value of the group. So what happens is that.
And this will answer your idea. There is the peer pressure, but because then you will vote anonymously, you can then go and vote. You know, that's already when you get back to a little bit to anonymity again because you vote.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So hopefully you try to reach an agreement on a widely accepted value. So what you would get here is, let's say you have 5 groups, you get 5 different values, and depending on how the groups actually worked it out together, you might get quite a bit of a difference between the values. So you have these group shared values, these social values from however groups you have. And then what you can do if you want to, you can open the floor to all the groups and tell them, you know, tell us which type of values did you agree with. And you would hear, let's say, 5 different values. And then you could ask each participant from every group to vote which value they personally feel that they're closer to. And I mean, we explain how you can do it in a protocol. You cannot vote for your own group, you vote for something else, and you try to see, again, by voting and by process of elimination, if you can reach to one singular value, a democratic value, right? So it's something that the majority would agree it's a fair increase in council tax, donation, whatever that is, for restoring peatlands. So basically, as you do those 4 steps, you get 2 different types of values. You had 2 different types of values before, willingness to pay 1 and willingness to pay 2. Now you have 2 more. You have the group shared values, 5 groups, 5 different values. And you have then, if you want, you have a single democratically agreed value, which is going to be the value in one of these groups. Which means that the group values, you can use them however you want. You can average them, you can report them as a range. If the range is actually quite big, it could be interesting to see. It could be, if we take the values from the group, it could be between 20 and 240. So, it's a big range, and then you can have a democratic single value. Again, as a reminder, these values should not be used for economic assessments, but they can act as really good sort of starting points, or to get a feeling of how a local group or a specific group could actually feel towards a price. And all the research that's been done has shown that people who do take part in these types of groups, they actually state that they feel much more confident about the values that came out from the group setting than they felt about other values. But the reason why this cannot be used in economic assessments is that because they're context dependent. They were generated from that workshop, from the information that people received, from the interaction. So these values are very true, but just for the people who are in that workshop. We cannot assume that these values will be true for others, even though people hopefully acted as representatives of others. So as I said, yeah, this could be a socially acceptable value for public investment that people will actually feel going forward. So I'm gonna hand over to Marie now for the last bit of that session.
Yeah, so thank you, Manoris. Hope you got now an understanding of what group shared values are and how they can be elicited. So now we have reached the kind of the last phase of the event, the workshop or event that you can run with participants. And the last phase is an important final, which is the debriefing of the session. So this kind of session can really help you to contextualize the values. So not only the shared value, but also the first individual values that you have elicited from the people, so the willingness to pay. And you can do it in several ways. You can try to understand different things you may want to try to understand from your participants. So the first one might be how much did their opinion about the important benefit change over the course of the session. So from willingness to pay 1 to willingness to pay 2, to the group shared values, to the democratic values. How did they feel their feelings have actually changed, and have they maybe been influenced by either the facilitator providing information or by the others' views? You may also want to collect feedback on whether they thought the process within a small groups was successful. So there is quite a series of questions that you may want to ask them, and this is very much depending on your interest and the kind of data you want to collect from the session. Something interesting also is because now you have provided your participants with a lot of information, a lot of new information, maybe for some of them. So you might want to also understand, will actually those people will this particular event have an impact in their life besides the kind of data you wanted to collect? So maybe they want to think of peatlands completely differently. They want to change some of the things they are doing in their life. So this is also some kind of information you could gather. And of course, this debriefing session might be valuable for you, so for recording, because you might extract some of these insights to communicate to policymakers. So that's also one way of using this debriefing session. So that's it. I think now we have really highlighted the key steps for suggestion of key steps for running such a deliberative monetary valuation method. And we would like two key things remaining out of the session is really some key points that Julia is going to highlight, and then we're going to go for a Q&A session.
Yeah, and this is really a final bit. So before we let you ask all your questions.
Yeah.
So just please remember, we have tried to highlight the points that we felt were key and necessary for you to understand the process and the concepts underpinning this, but the protocol contains much more details, okay, that we don't cover here. So hopefully you have time to go through it in your own time. Remember again, key of that part of that information is on the resources. So the resources is not like a complementary appendix, it's a fundamental part of the protocol. Remember, we haven't talked about sampling and participant recruitment, but now you hopefully know that is critical to the rest of the process, and we hope that we have provided enough clarity on that on the protocol itself. If not, please do ask. because this has critical implications on the actual values that you obtain and how can you use them. Very importantly, and because I know this is important for you, whether they can be used for cost-benefit analysis or not. Okay. Remember also, as Marie was pointing out, you need to have a very clear and precise design of the valuation card. Remember, the valuation card is where you frame the willingness to pay question. So you can adapt the one that we have, but remember to always keep very clear these framing elements that Marie was highlighting and that in the protocol. Remember that you're actually getting different kind of values here. You're getting willingness to pay value 1, willingness to pay 2, and share values. Only willingness to pay 1 is the one that you can use in cost-benefit analysis if done in a certain sampling procedure, but all of them have valuable meanings and uses that you can use to inform policy, to make the case, to try to inform policy, for example, about budget reallocation. So the last values that Manolis was telling you about, yes, you cannot use them in cost-benefit analysis, but you can use them to inform policymakers about the need to do budget reallocation, because people do see a fair value in this kind of investments. We also have provided you with some resources on how to compute the values. Obviously, here we have been talking about the individual willingness to pay values that each of the people give, but obviously you will have to aggregate that from your sample to the whole population that you're targeting. So here you have individual willingness to pay values. That's one person or one household. You obviously want the values of all the people that this sample is representing. So we have given you resources to do that in an Excel sheet and a few other things. So make sure that you consult and follow this protocol when you're preparing your session and making use of the resources. Okay, so